Welcome. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Kimberly Griffiths, Curator of Education at the Everson Museum of Art, and today I am excited to welcome you to our Everson Up Close Artist Series, inspired by our new exhibition, Who, What, When, Where. Before we get into our discussion, I just wanted to be sure you're aware of, what's some of the things happening at the Everson. So we have some incredible exhibitions that are open, and the museum is open to the public, and we have some new hours that are listed here. Please come on down and see Who, What, When, Where, which is on view through August 22nd. Tete-a-tete-a-tete, drawings by Beatrice Wood, Jaleel Campbell, Homecoming, and The Floating Bridge, Postmodern and Contemporary Japanese Ceramics. And please join us as we round out our series with our next speaker, Peter B. Jones, and then our last speaker in this series, Carrie Mae Weems. We are going to invite you to use the chat function to ask any questions at the end. Today, we have the wonderful opportunity to hear from artist Dawn Williams-Boyd. And Dawn will also be exhibiting at the Everson next year in her first traveling solo exhibition, which is so exciting. So welcome, Dawn. Thank you so much for coming. And I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Kimberly, for inviting me. Thank you to the Everson for inviting me to participate in this exhibition, and thanks to Fort Gansevoort in New York for encouraging me to be where I am today. Also like to shout out to the ancestors, as we always should do when we begin a new endeavor. So ashe, ashe. The artwork that you're going to see this evening is from an ongoing series that I have been working on for the last 20, 30 years called Sins of the Fathers. And the purpose of the Sins of the Fathers series is to record in a visual way some of the key points in the history of the United States from the perspective of its African-American citizens. Unlike many of my age peers, the college that I went to, Stevens College in Columbia, Missouri, did not offer a Black Studies program or African-American history, or bid-whist tournaments or anything mildly cultural like that. And so I came out of there without a lot of information that would turn out to color my artistic career from that point on. While sitting at the card table with my friends, listening to them discuss the history that they had learned while they're in school, it piqued an interest in me, and so I began this series. Now, the series of Sins of the Fathers consists of currently about 20 to 25 pieces that are cloth paintings, that are acrylic paintings on various surfaces, and one you'll see in a few minutes that is in a oven-baked clay that used to be called sculpting. So what I want to do is to let you know that the way that I work with my art, usually there are at least two stories that are being told, because I'm not only interested in this particular instance, in imparting information to you about the history of the country that we live in. I also want to talk to you about the artwork that I make, because I'm an artist and the artwork is at least as important. The way that I make it, the the parts of making it that interest me have a lot more to do than just the subject that's being portrayed. So all of the instances that are being portrayed in this series are true stories. There is no fiction here. All of the information that I'm going to give you can be verified with a little bit of time on your favorite internet browser. Just look up in a lot of instances, the titles of the pieces, and it'll take you to a place where you can learn more if you so choose. So we're going to start this one. Thank you, Kimberly, by the way, for moving the images around for me. I appreciate it. It allows me to wave my hands while I talk and not be concerned about the technology. I really appreciate it. So this is called The Middle Passage. It is a large cloth painting. I show it first because I'm going to present this body of work not chronologically by the time that I made it, but chronologically by the period of time that it happened. So this is the middle passage, which is a term that's used to describe the amount of time, the amount of space, the amount of cultural disruption that occurred between when enslaved Africans left the shores of Africa and arrived on the shores of the United States. I'm sure everyone here is aware of the 1619 Project, which came out a couple of years ago, that says that the first Black African touched down in Virginia in 1619, earlier than we had been told before. But this piece is about the time between when some of these captives survived the crossing and some didn't. You can see the skeleton in the right-hand third. You can see the water beneath him. The other two gentlemen are arranged shoulder to shoulder so that they can all squeeze into the ship. Thank you. So for information's sake, this is in fact all made of cloth. In this time frame, I was almost always using just cotton. There is a little piece of kente cloth there on the right-hand side. And I use that specifically because a lot of times I have heard, particularly African-American people say that, you know, we're all descended from African kings and queens, and undoubtedly some of us are, and so that's represented here. Royalty would be the group of people who wore kente cloth at the time, but some of us were also descended from the bakers and the bankers and the guys who swept the street. So next slide, please. This is the only piece that you will find in this collection so far that is not made of either fiber or acrylic paint. This is a product that used to be called Sculpey. It's a plastic-based clay, and the piece is called Strange Fruit, and it represents the time that we call Reconstruction in our history books after the end of the American Civil War. And I can't begin to give you statistics on the number of Black men and women who were hung from trees. If you are not familiar with it, you should look up Billie Holiday's song of the same title, Strange Fruit, and you will, it's a really good background for the image that we're looking at here. But and for those of you that might not know, this is a portrayal of an act of American terrorism from one American to another American. And so I want you to keep in mind as we go along here, not only is this a history of what has gone on in this country, but you've heard the term, in order to avoid repeating your history, you need to know your history, okay? So sometimes you're going to hear resonances of some issues that we are dealing with here in 2021, okay? So we're talking about hanging men and women from trees, from bridges. You can go to the next slide, Kimberly, because that'll bring the bridges word into play. This is Okemah, Oklahoma, and this occurred in 1911. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that hanging was not seen as a punishment for any crime that a person may have committed. Lynching was a way to terrorize the entire community, because there was no way to know if you had offended. There was no way to know if they were coming for you or the person who was standing next to you. There was no safety in being a female. There was no safety in being a child. One of the things that there is a book, there was an art exhibit called Without Sanctuary. And it is based on postcards that were made by photographers of this era and multiplied and sold at lynchings. And it was like an event. People would come from miles around when so-and-so is going to be lynched on Saturday. They would go in droves, get dressed up, and go and watch this person be executed without benefit of a judge and jury, an American citizen without benefit of a judge and jury. Next slide, please. This is Center, Texas, and this happened in 1920. Now, you'll notice this and the one previous to this are both acrylic paints on plywood. Before I began to devote myself exclusively to making this kind of image in fabric, I worked in many mediums, in oils on canvas, in acrylics on canvas, and I found that having a surface that in itself had more interest made the process more interesting to me. So I was given a load of distressed plywood by an acquaintance of mine. And so for several years, I did acrylic paintings on plywood of various thicknesses and various sizes. So this is one of those things. So I want you to notice in this one that the emphasis is not on the person who was lynched. All you see of that person is his bare foot and his boot in the background. What you are seeing is the good citizens, the law-abiding citizens, the landowners, the power brokers, the religious, God-fearing citizens of Center, Texas. And what interested me about these men's faces is the understanding that they didn't see anything wrong with what they were about. They simply felt like they were doing their jobs as white males to maintain the status quo. They had no thought at all for their own laws when it came to the destruction of the Black community. As I said, you could make any kind of error, from looking a white man in the face to refusing or not getting off the sidewalk fast enough for someone, for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Next slide, please. This is a cloth painting, as you can tell by all the lace, if you will look closely. This is 6 Feet of Water, Evangeline, Louisiana, 1927. Now, you will have noticed that the titles of these pieces are something to evoke your imagination. The name of the place where it took place and the year that it took place. And this was done specifically, again, so that if you want to know more about your own history, then you can use the title alone as a reference to, again, just put it into your favorite browser and you can have information about what actually happened. I'm very concerned that history has already begun to be rewritten. I think that's a very dangerous thing for our society. We need to know not only all the great things that happened in our history, but we need to know, we need to be able to see all the dirty petticoats. We need to open all the closets. We need to know what actually happened. And at this point in time, in a lot of instances, the only place where that information lies is in some old books. And that's where I get a lot of my information from, is those old books. So this is the Great Flood of 1927, when the Mississippi River overflowed its banks from Cairo, I think Cairo's in Illinois, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. So much rain came down, frankly, from November to like April, that the levees, which are big mounds of earth, which is supposed to contain the river water when it overflows, just gave way. And towns all along the 2,700 mile span were underwater. Now, so what that meant economically is that cities, towns, farms, crops, people, animals, livestock, everything was under not 3 or 4 feet of water, but 10, 15, 20 feet of water. This particular one says 6 feet of water in the streets of Evangeline, Louisiana. And it is based on a song by Randy Newman that's called Louisiana. The first time I heard the song, okay, I'm not gonna remember the man's name, but it was beautifully done by Aaron Neville. And it was just haunting to me. And of course, I didn't know anything about it, so I did a little research. And one of the things I found out is that not only did all of this destruction happen, but a sea change in the race relations of the United States occurred during this catastrophe. So, for example, in some towns where all of the white citizens were plenty of warning, packed up, moved to higher ground, safe. The Black citizens who lived in the lowest lying land to begin with were not allowed to leave in a lot of instances. Did this happen everywhere? No. But it did happen in some places, and it has been recorded and discussed, and it's a piece of history that we should all know. In some instances, Boy Scouts were required to stand over Black workers who were filling sandbags to try to shore up the levee so that the Black workers wouldn't try to leave. They were put in camps and kept under guard. They were, in fact, made to work without pay. That's called slavery. So not only, so the sea change that occurred is that when the waters finally went down, it was an agricultural society. The land couldn't be used right away. So what you have now is a bunch of farm workers, no farms to work on. So in many instances, not all, the Blacks who were no longer able to survive on the land because the land that they had been sharecropping or the land that the plantation owner had been having them work, it was no longer viable to keep body and soul together. So they packed up and they left. They went north where there were jobs in cities, or at least that's what they had been told. There were jobs in cities, and they left in huge numbers. And in the history books, in your favorite internet browser, the Great Migration. It changed the South from a strictly agricultural endeavor with lots and lots and lots of free labor to something else altogether because the labor had flitted away. There's two really interesting things that don't have anything to do with history that I wanted to say about this piece. This is one of the very first times that I used a fabric called organza with the purpose of, which is in fact mirror organza is what's called. If you look closely in the upper third behind the main characters, you can see a shimmer, and that's the light bouncing off the fabric. I've used it several times since then to indicate that something is underwater, and it's a love of mine. The lace that you see underneath the boat was given to me, back in 1996, 2005, when I did a project with children in Denver, Colorado. The neighborhood came together to give me all the supplies that I needed to do this project with the kids. And among those things were bags and bags and bags of lace and doilies. And so I had an opportunity to use them years and years and years after I actually got them. Next slide, please. This is, excuse me, Marion, Indiana. And again, and it is acrylics, it's acrylic washes on smoothed plywood. And it is, again, just an exploration of the faces and the demeanor of the people who were attending the lynching. One of the things I really enjoy about painting in acrylics is the ability to use hundreds of very thin layers of wash layers of acrylic pigment in a clear medium, and the building up of layers is what interests me about that. It's been a long time since I did any acrylic paints, and I'm maybe soon I will be looking to get back to it. Next slide, please. This is a cloth painting called Bad Blood. Tuskegee syphilis experiments, Macon County, Alabama, 1932 to 1972. That's the title. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service and the Center for Disease Control decided that they wanted to get some more information on the occurrences of syphilis in the Black American male. So they used 600 farmers, sharecroppers in Macon County, Alabama, from 1932 to 1972. They told the farmers that they had bad blood and that they were going to be given injections to help them with that problem. And so began the experimentation by the US Health Department on US citizens without their consent, without their knowledge. Your regular type of experiment. Half of the subjects got placebos and half got half got medications of one sort or another. Now, the problem with that is that in the 1940s early, penicillin was discovered and found to be a very good cure for syphilis. But the United States government did not end the Tuskegee experiment until a reporter came along in the early 70s. I'm sorry, I don't have his name, but it can be found online, and said to the powers that be, well, you know, we've been having this experiment for the last 40 years, and we discovered a cure 30 years ago. And doesn't it seem odd that we're still not curing these people when we have the means to do so? And the really interesting part is that the powers that be, the United States government, heard what he had to say and decided to go ahead and continue the experiment anyway, until this reporter made a big stink about it and brought the attention of the outside world to bear. So the interesting part about this piece for me is the coffin, because try as I might, I could not find a piece of fabric that looked enough like pine. These men were poor. You see them dressed in their Sunday best. And in the case of one of them, his Sunday best is a clean plaid shirt and his best pair of overalls. So they would not have had money to buy expensive coffins from anybody. There would have been probably a person whose job it was to make inexpensive coffins for this community out of raw pine. They would dig a hole and there you go. So I wanted to use the fact of their inability to have money to spend on that by making the coffin look like raw pine wood, but of course then I couldn't find any fabric. So I wound up having to paint the fabric. And so the coffin is made of a lightweight canvas that's been gessoed the way you would ordinarily gesso canvas, and then it's been painted with acrylic paints. This is one of 2 or 3 times when you're going to find acrylic paints mixed in with my fiber work. Next slide, please. This is Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and this particular lynching happened in 1935. The thing that interested me about this particular occurrence is the presence of the children. As I said, oftentimes the lynching of a Black man or woman was a festive occasion in our country, and people would come from miles around to witness this terrorism, in fact. And the fact that they would bring their children is just astounding to me. If you think about it, this happened in 1935. I guess 35 would be a stretch for somebody that was actually alive at that time, but we will continue and find that the olden times is not the end of this kind of atrocity in this country. Next slide, please. This is Little Rock, Arkansas, and I'm sure that you are probably familiar with the black and white photograph that this is based upon. This is Elizabeth Eckford, as she is one of the Little Rock 7 who is about to integrate that high school in Little Rock, Arkansas, when the National Guard had to be called out in order to convince the citizens excuse me, of Little Rock, that they needed to obey the laws of their duly elected president and legislature. The thing that interested me about this piece is that you always see a black and white photograph. This is and so you can see that she's wearing a plaid skirt, and it just always interested me to want to know, well, what color was the plaid? And so from that simple inquiry grew this piece. You'll notice this is a very early piece of mine. You'll notice that you have a border of patched fabric. So let me digress for just a second. What interested me and what flipped me from acrylics on cardboard or plywood or canvas or whatever to fabric was a teacher's workshop I did at Metropolitan State College in Denver, Colorado, that was about the artist Faith Ringgold, who, excuse me, at the time, among many things, was painting on canvas. And then instead of stretching that canvas, excuse me, over stretcher bars and framing it, she would quilt or patch the edges of the image. She and her mom, in fact, would patch the edges so that she could simply roll the piece into a tube and mail it that way versus having to create a crate for it. And having spent my entire career as a visual artist, having to be concerned about how to get a piece of artwork from my house to wherever it is being shown, which meant in some instances building crates or building boxes. That was a lovely idea. And then I took it one step further and asked myself, okay, well, if you're going to make the border out of fabric, why not make the entire image out of fabric? And this is one of the very early results of that question. This is, again, Little Rock, Arkansas. And we talked about the history already. It happened in 1957, and you can get more information about it online. Next slide, please. This is 3 Marys, freedom riders. 3 Marys is a very short sort of well, it's a very short series. It's got 3 pieces in it. And it began with a call to artists for work that illustrated a part of the Bible. I have always been really interested in Mary, the mother of Jesus. And there are probably half a dozen pieces in my repertoire over the years on various questions I have about the Virgin Mary and the relationship between God the Father and this woman and her son. So at any rate, the original piece in this series is called Three Marys Crucifixion, and it shows the crucifixion of Jesus. And all throughout European history, when you see the crucifixion, it is a subject that you see over and over and over again. You always see several women that are there, and one of them, and I have always been told, okay, well, one of them is his mother Mary, that makes sense. One of them is Mary Magdalene, that makes sense, but who's the other one? So there is a passage in, I believe, Luke and I believe John, that talks about the third Mary being the mother of somebody, but that there were in fact 3 women named Mary who were there, which I thought was just really interesting. So I did the piece of the crucifixion piece, and when I had finished doing the piece, it occurred to me that the composition of 3 women, obviously distressed, mourning over, howling over, screaming over a prone male, was a composition that you could tell a lot of stories with. So I began to venture out, and this is the second in the series. And that's the artistic part that interests me. In 1961, the Corps, which is the, can't remember the name of it, it'll come back to me in a minute, organized a bunch of bus rides in the American South to demonstrate to American Southerners that they would have to go by the rules that the federal government and the Supreme Court had made. They said that interstate bus travel could not be segregated, but Southerners in the United States still required that Black folks sit in the back of the bus. So this group took it upon themselves to demonstrate that that was something that we would not put up with anymore, okay? So young people young and old, from all over the country came to the South, got on these buses and rode, sitting wherever they want, Black ones, white ones, old, young, men, women, sat wherever they want. And they were met by violence at many places in the Southern United States. A famous one is represented in this particular image, where the mob set the bus on fire. And I thought that it would be an interesting subject to portray in this Three Marys group. And so that's why it exists. Go on the website, which is dawnwilliamsboyd.com, and you can see the other images, the other image that's in this series. It was a lot of fun. I think you'll get a giggle out of it. Next slide, please. This is Waiting for Medgar, Jackson, Mississippi, 1963, and it resides at the Everson Museum. Yay! This is a very special piece to me because it is it's got a lot of things happening in it that had never happened in my artwork before. So let me give you the story first. The gentleman that you see portrayed is named Byron De La Beckwith, and he was a citizen of Mississippi who was a white supremacist. Let's just be blunt. And he decided that Medgar Evers, who was a civil rights worker, he was an Army veteran, he was pioneer in desegregating, I believe it was the University of Mississippi, that Byron De La Beckwith decided that this Black man had gotten to be too uppity. His name was in the paper. He was gaining a little bit of notoriety as a very hard worker in the civil rights movement, a companion of the higher beings in that group and whatever. And so De La Beckwith, who was called De-La by his friends, took it upon himself to go to the neighborhood where the Evers lived, where Medgar lived with his wife and children, hide in a patch of honeysuckle about 100 yards from the Evers front door, take a high-powered rifle with a night scope and wait for Medgar to come home. Now, it was a full moon, which is why you can see the embroidered honeysuckle in his background. It's just why you can see the moon glinting off his white car and his white buckskin shoes, and why you can see the shadows that are thrown by the hood of the automobile. Keep in mind, please, that this piece is all done by hand. There's no, aside from a bead around the outside, there's no machine stitches in this piece. So that was the first time that I had done that. So back to the story. So he succeeded in shooting Medgar and killing him and getting away with it 3 times. He was identified by Black citizens who identified his car as having been in the neighborhood on the day that Medgar was killed. There were Black witnesses who gave various stories about how he was probably the person who was guilty. 3 times he was tried and acquitted by a jury of his peers. Only many years later, in the 70s, was a key piece of evidence, the rifle that he shot Medgar Evers with was found in the closet in the house of the judge who had presided over the first trial. Only when that piece of evidence and the will of the people of that community to say, well, you know, maybe the 4th time's the charm, was this man convicted and jailed for his crime. Next slide, please. This is called These Bones, Atlanta, Georgia, 1979. Now, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. I happened to be living in Denver, Colorado when this particular instance happened, but I was familiar with the neighborhood where it took place. For several years around 1979, more than 20 Black children, teens, and young adults were abducted from the streets of the Black community, one of the Black communities in Atlanta, Georgia. Some of the bodies were found, like the one portrayed here of one of the few females. Her name was Angel. She was found tied to a tree with with someone's underwear stuffed into her mouth. She had been beaten and brutalized and left tied to this tree, and she died. A Black man, Wayne Williams, is currently serving time for that. And a lot of people, myself included, believe that he is merely guilty of being naive and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, there are all kinds of rumors about why the children were abducted, what was the purpose, who was doing it, why it took the Black power structure in Atlanta, the mayor, the chief of police, et cetera, such a long time to gear up, to recognize that these children didn't just run away, that there was a pattern. So again, there is a book called Those Bones Are Not My Child. And coincidentally, I hadn't read it when I made this, but I am in the process of reading it right now. Was it Tony Bambara, I believe, is the author's name. Pardon me if I have got it incorrectly. The interesting thing about this piece, as far as the making of it, is that, and you'll have to really, really squint to see it, but the pine tree that Angel is tied to is made of embroidery floss. And I did it, that particular part of the piece and the part of the rope that she is tied with, I embroidered that while I was on an airplane, I think or at least part of it, from Atlanta to Denver. I spend the majority of my time at home working in my studio here, but in this particular instance, I had to go someplace, I don't remember where, and I was so involved in getting the piece done that I just took needle and thread with me. This was obviously back in the day when you could take needle and thread on a plane. So next slide, please. This is called Baby Boys. And I did this in Denver, Colorado in the 70s and 80s there, not only in Denver, but in many other places. We had a real problem, and I suppose we still do, though you don't hear about it on the television as much anymore on the news, but we had a problem with gang violence. It was something that was new. Well, it wasn't really new. I was going to say it's new in the Black community, but that's not true. We've had gangs in our community forever, but they, I guess what was different about it was that there was the children who were in the gangs were so young, and it had a rolling set of repercussions in the community, both Black and white, about why our children were being drawn to this kind of life, and how they could be whether or not they would survive, how could they be rescued? So anyway, at that time, it seemed like we were going to a lot of funerals of young people. And so this is, it's called Baby Boys with an apostrophe S, and it's Baby Boy's Funeral. And his mother and his relatives. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see a hooded figure peeking in, and that would be an indication of either the gang members' representative to at least show some respect because the violence that the gangs exchange caused the death of this young man. This is acrylics on plywood again. Next slide, please. This is Brooklyn, New York. An acquaintance of mine gave me a bunch of canvases. Just regular stretch canvases, and because he or she was leaving town. And so I did several, and they were all small, which is really odd for me. I don't like to work in no less than a 2x3 format, but I had canvas. And so I thought, well, I'll make a group of small paintings that, maybe they will sell well at a price that's commensurate with their size. So anyway, I did several. This is one of them. This is Abner Louima in Brooklyn, New York. It's called Brooklyn, New York, 1997. As you may know, there was a stated policy in the police departments in New York and surrounds where Black and brown men were allowed to be frisked for no reason. And the police in those jurisdictions took advantage of that situation and not only harassed them on the street, but took them to prison, to jail for no reason. There was and I can't remember the name, but this was also a time when the United States government decided that they had to do a war on crime. And one of the tenets of that war was to give extreme sentences for relatively minor offenses. So, there are still people in jail who, 30 years ago, sold an ounce of whatever. And the law has changed. And so selling that ounce of whatever is no longer against the law at all in some instances, or at the very least, it is a misdemeanor or something that you can pay a fine for, or something that you might spend a year or two in jail. But there are people who are still in jail for that same crime 40 years later. And so even though this piece was done back in the 90s, again, keep your ears up. There's all kinds of resonances in this older work of mine that apply now. And so what that says is about how far we have or have not come in the last little bit of time, the last 20 years. Next slide, please, Kimberly. This is Denver, Colorado, 1997 again, is a rough year. At the time that, the incident that's being shown is a young Black man was sitting on a bus stop in downtown Denver, Colorado, about maybe 6 or 7 blocks from where I lived at the time. And some young white man came along and said, "Are you ready to die?" and used a racial slur, which I will not stoop to use in this instance. And they said, this downtown Denver, Colorado is not a place for racial slur, and proceeded to pull out a gun and not only shoot this young man, but a woman unrelated to him who happened to just be sitting on the bus stop at the same time. This is acrylics on canvas. And again, it's a part of the small group that I did at that time. Next slide, please. This is Bel Air, California, 1997. You all may remember that Ennis Cosby, the son of Bill Cosby, was killed or found dead on the side of the road in Bel Air, California. And as far as I know, no one has been prosecuted. The evidence showed that he had stopped on the side of the road. He'd been approached by some young men or from someone who had said something to the effect of, "Do you have a smoke?" Because he had cigarettes, a pack of cigarettes in his hand when his body was found, and he was shot from very close. And so again, this, like all of the pieces in this group, are instances of racially motivated violence against African Americans as a way to remember, to not let future generations think that it's been all peaches and cream throughout our history. I think there's one more, Kimberly, so next slide, please. This is Jasper, Texas, 1998. Now, this is again a true story. It is a story of a man, a Black man, who was walking home from a meeting in his neighborhood, something that he had done countless times before. Two young men who were eventually, as far as I know, were eventually convicted of, well, who were in fact convicted of this crime, accosted him, tied him to the back of their pickup, and dragged his body around in the woods for several hours, and then left the remains of his body in the road for others to find. So, my motivation for the entire series is why? What was the point? What are you so afraid of? What's your motivation? What is it that you're trying to prove? That you can? Obviously you can. But why? And have you not heard or read in the Bible where it says the sins of the fathers will be brought back and help, and the future generations will be held responsible for those sins, generations upon generation upon generation. How much longer do we live this way? Now I'm starting to sound like my mother, so I'm gonna stop. Thank you, Kimberly. I appreciate you did a great job.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. Wow, Dawn, thank you. That was incredibly powerful. And now I would like to invite folks, if you have any questions for Dawn, please use questions or comments. Please use the chat to make those comments, please. I'm just wondering, what about I have a question. Your more recent work, or what your work now, or where you're going with your work, future work.
before COVID, my plan was I'm president of a group of visual artists called African Americans for the Arts here in Atlanta, Georgia. And my plan was to have that group of artists do a series of exhibitions called Black Visual Artists Have Something to Say. I believe that any Black visual artist out there will know what I'm talking about, but every February is a really hot time for us because it's African American History Month. Or sometimes it even spills into March because that's Women's History Month, but it's kind of quiet in our studios the rest of the year. So I've also noticed that in some instances, Black art, if you will, consists of 2 or 3 genres. One shows the time when our ancestors were enslaved, picking cotton. One shows beautiful brown bodies entwined in romantic situations. One shows cute little kids. And I feel like in my work, and other artists should have something to say about what's going on in the world that we live in. Whether it has to do with the fact that we are Black or not, because Black or not, we are all citizens of this world. We all have to face the issues that are making it or that are happening in our society, in our world, on our planet today. And so I challenged my group of artists to have something to say about a list of subjects that with everything from Black Lives Matter to plastic in the oceans. And so the plan was to do one month show per month in 2021, that we would given ourselves a year to make new artwork. And so then COVID came along and ruined that plan. But we in fact have a show that is opening at the Hudgens Center for the Arts on the 5th of June. And if you're in Atlanta, be sure to drop by.
Thank you. So Deborah Ponder has a question. Deborah, you know Deborah, I guess. Always enjoy and learn from your exhibits. What artists most influenced you?
I love that question because my answer is so odd. There's 2. I'll give you the easy one. Faith Ringgold, that I mentioned in my piece, inspired me to do the kind of work that I'm doing, both the physical kind, the fabric, and the political kind. She has always had something to say. She has always used Black bodies, Black stories, Black culture to say what she had to say about the world in general. And I admire her greatly. The other is Albrecht Durer, who is an artist, Kimberly, you probably know, I don't know, is he Flemish or something, but from the 1600s. And what I admire about him is the precision with which he draws. I'm a big fan of the line and the emotion of the line, and the way that a line is used, something as simple as a straight line is used to tell volumes of stories. So those are my 2 major influences.
So I'll just share a few of the comments with you. I'm not sure if you can see them, but speechless. It was so moving and enlightening. Thank you for this work. It's a calling. I grew up in Alabama in the 50s. Greetings from the Mile High City. Work is so powerful. As a sister fiber artist, I'm thrilled by your commitment to tell the truth.
Thank you.
Yes, incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I can't remember ever feeling so much emotion from art. I so agree with that. It's just, wow.
Good.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dawn. It was a pleasure hearing from you and learning more about your work. And I'm very much looking forward to your solo exhibition at the Everson and continuing to work with you and getting to know you and having our community connect with your work. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And thank you so much, Dawn.
It's been my pleasure, Kimberly. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. Have a great night. Bye-bye.
I will. You do the same.